We're going to read this book. It's called Gorillas. It's by Seymour Simon.
Wonder, amazement, intrigue. These are some of the emotions that change everyday books into worn page-turners. To capture the attention of these busy, sometimes squirmy second graders is a challenge for any author, and only some have mastered the skill. Fewer still are able to do that with non-fictional characters.
I like to write the way he wrote it.
He is one of my favorite authors.
Seymour Simon's nonfiction books take children on adventures around the world and even out of this world.
It's like I'm stepping into a whole different world.
Learn the unusual way this author had to convince an editor to publish his most popular title.
So here we are, flying paper airplanes out on Madison Avenue, and after a while we look out, and down on the street below, people are beginning to look up. The paper airplanes are coming down on their heads.
See what made this author, who often photographs for his own books, lose his cool.
I was so terrified about the thought of it that I had forgotten to take my camera with me.
Are you serious?
I'm completely serious.
Plus, this witty writer will even share some of his favorite jokes.
What about the lion who's lost in the desert who's called Sandy Claus?
That's next on A Conversation with Seymour Simon.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with us today. I really appreciate it. One of the things I wanted to start out with is the New York Times has called you the Dean of Science Books for Children.
Yeah.
Kirkus Reviews, which reviews 5,000 fiction, mystery, sci-fi, children's, young adult books every year, they have said, Simon may have done more than any other living author to help us understand and appreciate the beauty of our planet and our universe. What do you think when you hear things like that are written?
I think somehow my mother got into both of those places and wrote those blurbs. I have no idea how those magnificent excerpts came about, and I was absolutely stunned and pleased that anybody could say something like that. It's really an extreme honor to be cited in those ways. I'm just enormously pleased, but how it came about, I don't have a clue. Sorry.
Well, you've been writing for some time now. And in fact, do you have any idea how many books you have written?
And I assume you're talking about books that were published, because books that you've written and books that you've had published are two different things. The first book I ever wrote, I wrote when I was in second grade. It was a book called Space Monsters, because I loved reading stories about space monsters. And the only person who published that book was my second grade teacher, who stapled the pages together. But of the books that I've had published by so-called real publishers, it's about 250, about 250.
Whenever you look at your books, the thing that you notice is they're very engaging for kids. There's a lot of call to action. Think about this, do this. When you're writing your books, do you think back to that first book you wrote in school and what intrigued you at that time, or what is it that helps you in writing these books for children?
It really has to interest me. I have to read it out loud, and when I'm reading it out loud, if I ask myself, does that really explain what I'm talking about? And if I ask that question, the answer is no, because when it actually does explain it, that little bell goes off in my head, and I know that, oh yeah, that's what I meant.
Well, and something else that I noticed in your books is that you put everything in perspective for a kid. For example, I was looking at your spider book the other day, and you had, a jumping spider can leap a distance of about 40 times the length of its body. That would be like you jumping the length of 2 basketball courts and making a slam dunk. So kind of putting it in perspective. Or in the brain book, you wrote, the cortex is made up of 10 to 14 billion neurons. That's many more neurons than there are people in the world. Do you feel that's important? Because when you say a billion to a kid, or 3.5 million, what does that mean?
Yeah. Numbers don't mean anything. not just to kids, but to adults either. Nobody really knows. You say a billion, nobody even knows what a million is. Nobody even knows what 1,000 is. If you had dollar bills and piled them up so they reached from the floor to the ceiling, I'm pretty sure that nobody knows how many dollar bills that would be. And similarly, if you talk about this animal is so big that it weighs 70 tons, nobody has the vaguest idea, what does that mean, 70 tons? So sort of my favorite comparison is when I was trying to explain the size of a blue whale, which is the biggest animal in the world. The biggest animal that ever lived is a blue whale. And I was thinking, well, how do you explain to a kid the size of this whale? Because the largest photograph in a book is going to be small compared to the size of a whale. So in the book I wrote, the whale is so big that its tongue, just its tongue, weighs as much as an elephant. And suddenly, you get an idea of the size of this animal.
How do you come up with those comparisons?
Sometimes you do it in a kind of a mechanical way. You find out how much the tongue of a blue whale weighs, and then you begin to look up things which weigh as much as that, and you begin to think of which of these comparisons would be most meaningful to a kid. So, and sometimes the comparisons just occur to you, but the truth is that comparisons are hard work. It's like any other kind of writing. The best comparisons might be those that took you hours or even days to come up with.
Well, and you talk about a lot of things that kids are interested in, comparing tongues and whale bodies. I mean, that's something that a kid would enjoy.
No, it's something an adult would enjoy
Well,
as well.
Yeah,
Let me tell you that if I didn't enjoy it still, I wouldn't be doing it. One of the things that writers for children have to have is this childlike enthusiasm for what they're doing. Not childish, but childlike. And I would hope that for as long as I live, I still have that childlike enthusiasm.
I love the story that you told about getting kids interested in reading and science and exploring both areas, about the kid who was reading about the snakes. Could you tell me about that?
Yeah, sure. I wrote a book about deserts, and in this book about deserts, one of the photographs shows a sidewinder on the desert floor, and you can see the tracks that the sidewinder made, and it's kind of a very peculiar way of moving across the desert floor. And I went into a library, and there was a kid on the floor, and he was wiggling on the floor, and I said to the kid, "What are you doing?" And the kid said he was trying to make the same kind of tracks on the floor as the sidewinder made in that photograph. I think that's, by the way, a wonderful example of how a photograph can be so evocative. It's not just, oh, isn't that a pretty photograph, but it's a photograph which gets you to think as well.
You've written on so many different areas of the world, the rainforest, everywhere. Do you often go to those places when you're researching?
I try to. Of course, it's not that easy to get to Mars, so there are some places
Right.
that I can't get to. I try to go. So, for example, when I first started to do photo essay books about earth sciences, I read a lot of poetry, and I remembered Robert Frost's poem called Fire and Ice, and I wanted to do a book about volcanoes and a book about icebergs and glaciers. And so I decided that I would have to go to Hawaii and take photographs, because after all, somebody has to do that.
Darn.
Might as well, be me. So I did go to Hawaii, to the Big Island, where they have Volcanic National Park, and I did take lots of photographs. And I did decide that I would go to Alaska, and I was invited to speak in a town called Ketchikan, which is one of the third or fourth largest cities in Alaska. But there were no icebergs or glaciers to be seen, and I was told that I really had to get into a plane and go out to look at them, and I said, okay. And they said that the only plane available would be the husband of the librarian had a single-engine plane, and I sort of like a minimum of 16 engines on a plane when I go up. So I said, if it ever stops raining, I'll be glad to go up, knowing that it rains 400 days a year in Ketchikan, except for the week that I was there. It didn't rain at all.
You were supposed to go.
On Thursday, I had run out of excuses, and I met him at the dock, and it was a seaplane because that's the way they take off. And we did go up. Won't tell you the entire story, but it was kind of terrifying at the beginning. And after a while, I realized that it was some of the most beautiful country I had ever seen in my life. But the problem was I was so terrified about the thought of it that I had forgotten to take my camera with me.
Are you serious?
I'm completely serious. So the photographs in my book on icebergs and glaciers are not mine.
But you can say that, yes, that's what they
Yes,
look like.
that's what they look like. I can testify that's what they look like.
Through fingers or?
No, by then I was actually more interested in what I was seeing than in my own survival.
Go back to a lot of your experiences as a kid, though, in writing as well, from what I've read. In fact, when you grew up, you played in a vacant lot that actually turned into a book, right?
Yes, it was called Science in a Vacant Lot. I grew up in the Bronx, which is about as urban an environment as you possibly can imagine. But even on my block, which was full of houses, there was a vacant lot. And the vacant lot was overgrown with weeds, and it was overrun with insects and other little creatures, earthworms and so on. And there was an awful lot of natural stuff that you could observe in that vacant lot. And I thought that the point of that book was that even in a city environment, nature is always with you. And of course that's true with weather. I mean, lightning happens in the city as well as in the country. Tornadoes happen in St. Louis. Boy, do they happen.
Yeah.
In St. Louis as well as in the country. So science is really all around us, not just in fields in the country, but in vacant lots in the city as well.
There is one title that keeps coming back, and kids love it. And it was a title that didn't even have the vivid, beautiful photos. And we're talking about the one on the paper airplanes, right?
Yes, I have a paper airplane book. It's called, again, notice the title, The Paper Airplane Book. It's about paper airplanes. So that's the title of the book. And I wrote this book because when I was a kid, I used to love to make paper airplanes. And when I became a science teacher, I was teaching 9th grade science, and just before we were going to begin studying air as a subject, I gave the kids in my 9th grade class a kind of a weird homework assignment. I said, I want you to go home and make the best paper airplane that you can and bring it in to school tomorrow. And if the weather is nice, we're going to go outside and we're going to have a paper airplane flying contest. And for a change, the 9th graders did their homework that day, and we'd go outside and we were playing with paper airplanes all day long, but we were also learning about air and aerodynamics. And I was only doing this for about 10 years before I realized I could write a book about this, because I'm very quick on the uptake about things. When I sent the manuscript in, I got a call from my editor, and she said, Seymour, we're going to have problems with this book. Would you come down to my office and speak to me about it? I felt kind of like a kid who was told by the teacher, stay after class, you know, we're going to have problems with it. So after I taught that day, I took a subway train into Manhattan and walked over to Madison Avenue, and the offices were on the 17th floor of a skyscraper on Madison Avenue, and I was feeling rather sick to my stomach. And my editor met me up on the 17th floor, and she took me into her tiny little office because I was a minor writer and she was a minor editor. And she had an office about the size of a telephone booth, and we went over the manuscript, and finally I said, you know, you said you're going to have problems, you really haven't told me anything. And she said, well, you know, the main problem is that you have directions on how to make about a dozen different paper airplanes, and I don't know whether these paper airplanes really fly. Suppose we publish a book, paper airplanes don't fly, the book will be terrible. And I said, you know, I know that they fly because I've made them hundreds of times, but maybe my directions are not that great. The only way to find out would be you read the directions, you fold the paper airplanes, and we'll fly them in your office. Oh. And she said, are you kidding? My office is so tiny, I'll smack right into the ceiling or into the walls. I said, yeah, we're on the 17th floor. Let's open up the window, we'll fly it out the window. So here we are flying paper airplanes out on Madison Avenue. And after a while, we look out, and down on the street below, people are beginning to look up. The paper airplanes are coming down on their heads, and they don't know where they're coming from. But there's another skyscraper right across the street, and the windows are filled with people watching us. They don't believe what they're seeing. And one of the windows, there's a guy going like this to me. And I figure I knew what he meant, except that 5 minutes after he did that, the bottom of his window opened and a paper airplane flew out of his window. So as soon as I saw that, I knew that book was going to be a big success. And so it has proved to be. The book was first published in 1971, and it's still in print, and I still get paper airplanes in the mail. When I heard the learned astronomer with the proofs, the figures were arranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and the diagrams.
You mentioned that you were a teacher for many years. How many years?
I taught for 23 years.
Do you ever miss the classroom?
I don't miss teaching because I speak in schools around the country. Mm-hmm. And the truth is I teach. So when I speak to kids, they think I'm going to be talking about things like, oh, I'm such a great writer, but I really talk about science. I talk about the subjects that I'm write about, and I still teach. Only now I have signs, welcome Mr. Simon. And when I was teaching, nobody wrote that on the classroom blackboard, but I still teach.
When you go into those classrooms, do you think there's a significant change in the way kids learn now, or even the things that they're interested in now compared to when you were in the classroom with them years ago?
You know, I know that you would like me to say yes, but the answer is no. And at least in my experience, and I've been in classrooms around the country, in schools, in inner city schools. I just spoke in a school in Harlem last week, and I've been in schools and communities in Connecticut and in Ohio and in California. And the truth is that if I didn't know what state I was in, I wouldn't know where those kids were from. They're all interested in what I'm saying. They all love what I'm talking about. They're still interested in reading books. They still are fascinated by the kinds of things that I'm talking about. I do know that there is a digital revolution, and I'm very aware of it, and I am organizing my own books and my own website to take advantage of the fact that kids are now on the internet so much, but I don't think that books will ever be outdated.
A gorilla also has 10 fingers and 10 toes and 32 teeth. You have all of those too, except you have only 28 teeth.
I wanted to talk a little bit about Einstein Anderson, which has a quirky resemblance to you in some ways, right?
Yes. The Einstein Anderson Science Detective is about this 5th grade science genius. When I first began to write those stories, and before any of them were published, I wrote a couple of the stories, and I would present them to my science classes at the end of the term, and the kids who were able to solve the problems, the science problems in the stories, I would call Einstein for a day. And that's really where the name came about. Though in all honesty, I wanted to name the series Seymour the Mad Scientist, but my editor thought that that was pretty tacky, so she talked me out of it. But he's nicknamed Einstein after the greatest scientist of the 20th century.
He likes to do something that you like to do, and it has to do with puns and jokes.
Yes, when I taught, I loved to make puns about what I was teaching, and nobody would laugh except about 2 or 3 minutes after I made the pun. Some kid in the class would burst out in hysterical laughter because he realized I had made a joke 2 minutes ago and he just got it. So with Einstein, it was my chance to get all of those puns and inflict them on the kids. Though I have to say that my editors love the puns too. So it turns out that not just kids love puns, adults love puns as well.
And you even wrote a book on jokes.
Yeah, I compiled a bunch of these terrible puns. It's called Silly Animal Jokes and Riddles.
Can I talk you into sharing at least one of those jokes with us?
Well, the joke that I shared with you outside, which was the man who walks in on a friend of his who's playing chess with his dog, and he looks at them and he says, "I can't believe it, that dog is so smart, he's playing chess." And his friend says, "Oh, he's not so smart, I beat him 3 out of 5 games."
Right.
You like that?
Those are good, I like it, I like it.
What about the lion who's lost in the desert who's called Sandy Claus?
2, 1. Clock start flight. Roger. Gus Skull, engine tracker.
One of the first things that you wrote was for Scholastic, right before the first landing on the moon. So much has changed in science since that article.
It's amazing. It's amazing. I was teaching at the time, and I wrote an article about what we might expect when we went to the moon. And I love the fact that when we landed on the moon, it was like a science fiction story. You know, Neil Armstrong first set foot on the surface of the moon. I had read science fiction all my life, and it felt as if this was a science fiction story coming true. But this is still going on. It's not perhaps as dramatic as landing on the moon, but there are so many fields of science which are really cutting edge. We're all fascinated by technology, but the truth is that equally incredible advances are happening in medicine and in biology, as well as in astronomy. So a lot is going on in science. We're at the opening of an incredible new age of discovery.
Well, that's what I was curious about. For someone who's been so involved with science for many years, is there one discovery or an invention that you think has really changed the world the most?
I suppose the invention which has really made the most difference in our lifetime is the computer. And it's the individual computer. We used to think that individual computers would isolate each of us, and we would be each person in a separate place working on his separate computers. And the computer has made us into a global village, so that when we use computers now, we don't really use computers as an individual in some separate place, someplace off in our own house or in the desert, but we're linked up to everybody else in the world, and I think that that's the most amazing thing that's happened.
A lot of your books are dedicated to Joel, Benjamin, Chloe, and Jeremy. Those are your grandchildren?
Those are my grandchildren. I have 3 grandsons and 1 granddaughter, and I'll tell you a quick story about one of those. So when Joel, who's my oldest grandson, was 4 years old, he was very interested in trucks, and I determined that I would write a book for him about trucks, but it takes a while for a book to come out. So I finally had the book come out, and I dedicated it to Joel, and I proudly presented it to him, and I said, "Joel, Grandpa has done a book on trucks for you." And he looked at the book and he said, "Grandpa, I'm not interested in trucks anymore." And then he saw the look on my face. He said, "No, that's okay. Benjamin is interested in trucks." Benjamin is his younger brother.
Little brother.
So I realized that the kids grow up, but other kids come along and they're interested in trucks too.
There you go.
So there you go.
It goes back to kids being interested in the same things years and years later. What do they think about having a grandpa whose name is all over the library and all over the bookstore?
They figure that everybody has the same kind of grandpa. They you know, love my books, but they've seen so many of my books that at this point they would rather have me play basketball with them than show them a new book dedicated to them. I have plans for a new series of books. I have plans for integrating my books with digital media. So I'm always interested in doing new projects, and I'm continually involved in the conception of new projects. When I was a young writer and I had written a couple of books, I began to think to myself, will I ever think about a topic for a new book? And now that I've written 250 different books, I never worry about a topic, because in truth there are very many more topics than I will ever get to, and there are always new topics that I can write about.
Just remaining curious about things.
You know, just remaining curious. And kids are curious about everything. And I think one of the worst things that can happen when kids become adults is that adults lose that edge of curiosity. I think an adult should always remain kind of a kid and always be curious.
Do you consider yourself kind of a kid?
Of course. Are you kidding? I mean, not only do I consider myself a kind of a kid, but everybody that I know considers me a kind of a kid, including my own kids who consider me, which elicits the following response. Dad!
But don't you think that's what's made you successful as a children's book writer?
You know, whether it's made me successful or not is beside the point. You have to be true to yourself. And being true to myself means that I'm a kind of a kid.
What is it about his books that you like? Why are they good?
I just think they're inspiring and that they get other kids to develop the experience with animals.
It was interesting, and it gave me something to be interested about.
It's about animals, and I love gorillas so much because they can do a lot of stuff, and it's cool.
So if you could talk to Seymour Simon, maybe you wanted to give him a compliment, or just, what would you say to him?
I'd say I like how you express your funniness in every book you read and write.
This Seymour Simon, we interviewed him. We got to talk to him, the guy who wrote these books. What would you like to tell him about his books if you got to talk to him?
Well, I've read another book. It's called Horses that he's read. It's a really good book.
We got to interview the guy who wrote that book, Seymour Simon, and he was really funny. He's a funny guy. What would you like to tell him if you got to meet him?
What made you write about this?
No, we actually got to meet Seymour Simon, the author of that book. He's written a lot of books, and so we got to talk to him. He's a really funny man. And, yeah.
He is one of my favorite authors.
What would you like to tell him?
That he should keep on writing these books and making sure that he has the good details and that he can inspire children about.